Hello everyone, it's me Biotechy, and today we will be looking at polyhydroxyalkanoates, also known as PHA. First and foremost, we have to understand what plant biopolymers are, and that's because polyhydroxyalkanate is also a plant biopolymer. And for me, from what I see, I will differentiate plant biopolymers into two parts. The first part being plant biopolymers, which are rather easy to purify, such as starch, fibrous proteins, and cyanophycin. And the other part of it is more problematic to synthesize or to produce. For example, cellulose and polyhydroxyalkanoates. Some of these biopolymers are more problematic to produce, and that's because of its metabolic pathway, or maybe some kind of a synthesis pathway where you need to use advanced equipment to produce. So right now, there are actually a lot of biopolymers which are able to replace petroleum-derived polymers such as your plastics, your daily use plastics. However, in order for us to actually decide whether or not we should use these biopolymers instead of plastics depends on several factors. For example, quality, quantity, production costs, and the potential value added properties. And allow me to elaborate. In terms of quality, we look at tensile strength or maybe biodegradability compared to petroleum-derived polymers. And also the quantity, the amount of biopolymers we can produce within an hour compared to plastic, for example. The production costs. Is it more expensive to produce these plant-based biopolymers? If yes, how much more do we need to use to produce these biopolymers? Or is it way cheaper compared to plastics? Potential value added properties, for example, is it thermoplastic? Is it biocompatible to a lot of things? If, like for example, we add sulfur, will it turn better or something like that? These kind of factors will influence the direct production of polymers in plants and microorganisms. So here's a list of natural plant biopolymers, namely starch, cellulose, rubber, and proteins. Starch and cellulose are widely available, whereas for starch, it's mainly used in food feed field applications, and that's because starch can be produced abundantly, it is cheap to produce starch, and most importantly, it's biodegradable. For example, imagine a paper which is made from starch. It can dissolve easily when you place it in water. It's the exact same thing. However, starch biopolymer has poor mechanical strength. It's very sensitive to moisture and very low heat resistance. So it can't really be a viable substitute for plastics in a lot of situations. Now, cellulose, it's also produced abundantly, can be found abundantly. It has a lot of sources. It has higher strength compared to starch, reinforcing capacity in composites. However, the purification is energy intensive and costly. That's the downside for cellulose. Rubber. Rubber can be found by the rubber trees, and it's mostly used in tires, latex products, and medical applications. It is elastic compared to starch and cellulose. Resilient, puncture, resealing, abrasion, and impact resistance. However, due to socio-economic pressures and climate changes, it's not really ideal to get rubber nowadays. Next, you have protein. Protein, you can get protein by byproducts of starch, oil, and biofuel industries. And current applications are soy plastics, wheat gluten plastics. It is also renewable, potentially abundant with biofuel byproducts. However, it is sensitive to microbial degradation and water too, and the durability isn't that ideal too. Well, starch, cellulose, latex, they have their own limitations, and sometimes they aren't good alternatives for plastics. So what other choices do we have? To answer that question, allow me to introduce you to polyhydroxyalkanoates. also known as PHA. Well, PHA is a type of polyester, and in order to produce these polyesters, we have to induce a certain condition for bacteria or plants. One example is to limit the nitrogen sources and to provide this bacteria with excess carbon. Therefore, the bacteria will then convert this carbon storage into polyhydroxyalkanoates, and this is how scientists harvest PHA. So let's look into the history of PHA. In 1992, researchers and scientists have successfully shown that plants could be genetically engineered to produce PHA. By transferring the gene of this bacterium into a plant, we are able to artificially induce PHA production. Well, now let's look into the types of PHA. There's a lot of types of PHA, but allow me to just elaborate the three main PHA types. The first is SCL PHA, short chain length PHA. The reason why it's called short is because this PHA only consists of 3 to 5 carbon monomers. The next is MCL PHA, medium chain length PHA. Medium chain length has more carbon monomers, consisting of 6 to 16 carbon monomers. The difference between SCL PHA and MCL PHA is, of course, physically, SCL PHA is more brittle compared to MCL PHA, and as you can see from this image right here, this lab-grown MCL PHA, it has more of a rubber-like material consistency. The reason being is because SCL PHA has less carbon monomers, and MCL PHA has longer carbon monomers. The longer your monomers are, the more flexibility and point of rotations you have, and therefore it is softer and more flexible compared to SCL PHA. There's also another type of PHA which is known as PHB, poly-3-hydroxybutyrate. The simplest PHA, easy to produce, and is relatively hard and brittle just like SCL PHA. So in general, PHAs are considered for materials that ends up in the environment. For example, like this packaging, food packages, and maybe other plastic. So let's look into the examples. PHA can be used to substitute materials used to make flower pots used in planting, foils, bags, and fishing lines and nets. Because they decompose, they are biodegradable, they are eco-friendly. Whereas the other side of PHA usage is in the biomedical application. For example, like bottles, cups, plates, cutlery, and other things that should be composted but not recycled. Here's a pathway of the PHB, one of the PHA synthesis from acetyl coenzyme A, which is from here. So from acetyl coenzyme A, it will be converted into PHA. And it's not only acetyl coenzyme A, but you can also turn fatty acid into PHA with the right conditions. The limiting condition is nitrogen, and we will produce PHA by providing them with enough carbon sources. Acetyl coenzyme A and fatty acids are both the carbon sources for these bacteriums or plants to produce PHA. In conclusion, even though we have discovered a lot of biopolymers which have somewhat of a similar property compared to petroleum-derived plastics, we still cannot entirely dismiss or to replace these petroleum-derived plastics, and that's because of such advantages that these petroleum-derived plastics have. Oil can be cheaply transported over large distances, whereas if you compare to plant-based biopolymers, they are bulky and more expensive to transport. And aside from that, oil can be distilled into fractions and be turned into a lot more and can be used for a lot more applications, whereas for biomolymers, you have to, for example, distill it, you have to convert it through another synthesis pathway to turn it into something better, or even so you need to co-polymerize it with other materials to turn it into better material. So these are the disadvantages these biopolymers have when compared to petroleum-derived plastics. So let us not give up and try to strive for a better future by keep on doing research and just trying to discover more ways we could replace petroleum-derived plastics. In the end, I'm quite certain that biopolymers such as polyhydroxyalkanoates will be able to replace these petroleum-derived plastics in the future when we have made it more publicly available or make it more easily accessible to the public. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I hope you learned something about biopolymers, especially more about polyhydroxyalkanoates. And here's a list of references that I've taken note of in order to produce this video. Thank you so much, and see you. Bye bye.